June 14th, 1943. North Africa. The scorching sun beats down on the surrendered Wehrmacht soldiers near Bizerte, Tunisia. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter raises his hands higher as American GIs move through the columns of defeated German soldiers. His uniform is caked with dust and dried sweat, his canteen empty for 2 days. Around him, thousands of men from the Afrika Korps stand in ragged lines, their faces hollow with exhaustion and defeat. The Americans shout orders in a language most don't understand, but the meaning is clear enough. The war, for them, is over. Klaus is 23 years old, a machine gunner from Bavaria who'd been told the Americans were savage warriors who showed no mercy to prisoners. His commanding officers had painted vivid pictures of torture and execution, of POWs worked to death in labor camps worse than anything the Reich had ever conceived. As rough hands search him for weapons and remove his identification tags, Klaus braces himself for brutality. Instead, an American corporal hands him a canteen of water. "Drink," the soldier says in broken German, making a gesture to his mouth. Klaus drinks. The water is cool, clean, and plentiful. He finishes the canteen and the American simply refills it from a larger container and moves to the next prisoner. No beatings. No shots fired into the crowd to maintain order. Just water and the heat and the strange gentleness of captivity. The processing takes 3 days. Klaus and roughly 4,000 other German soldiers are loaded onto trucks that carry them to the port. They're given rations, hard biscuits, canned meat, chocolate. More food than many of them have seen in weeks of fighting through the desert. The American guards are young, mostly bored-looking, carrying rifles, but not particularly hostile. Some even share cigarettes through the wire fencing that separates captors from captives. "Where are they taking us?" asks Gefreiter Hans Weber, a radio man from Hamburg who'd surrendered alongside Klaus. His voice trembles with uncertainty. "Probably to England," Klaus replies, though he doesn't really know. "Maybe a camp there before they figure out what to do with us." They board a transport ship called the USS Monticello, a converted luxury liner now painted navy gray. The prisoners are packed into converted cargo holds, hundreds of men in spaces designed for dozens. But even this is better than expected. There are bunks, not just floor space. There are latrines, crude but functional. And twice a day, American sailors distribute food, not much, but consistent, reliable. Klaus begins to notice something that disturbs him more than any beating could. The Americans seem almost indifferent to their hatred. They guard the Germans professionally, efficiently, without the personal malice he'd been taught to expect. The Atlantic crossing takes 11 days. The ship rolls through moderate seas, and seasickness spreads through the holds like contagion. Klaus spends hours watching the other prisoners, listening to their whispered conversations. Some are bitter, cursing their commanders for the defeat. Others seem relieved, quietly grateful to have survived. A few still believe in the Führer's victory, insisting this is merely a temporary setback before the Reich's inevitable triumph. On the morning of July 3rd, Klaus wakes to a change in the ship's engines. The steady throb that has marked their days at sea shifts, slows. Men rush to the small portholes, pressing their faces against the glass to catch glimpses of land. But it's not the English coastline they see, not the gray cliffs or industrial ports they'd expected. "That's not England," whispers Hans, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the hold. Klaus peers through a porthole and sees something that makes his breath catch. Palm trees. bright sunshine glinting off modern buildings. A harbor bustling with activity under a sky so blue it looks painted. The air that filters down through the ventilation shafts is hot, but it's a different heat than Africa. Humid, heavy, almost tropical. "Where are we?" someone asks, the question echoing through the hold. The ship docks with a shudder of engines and the clanking of chains. American voices call out orders on deck. The prisoners are formed into lines and marched up onto the deck for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The sunlight is blinding after days in the dim holds. Klaus shields his eyes and looks out at the port around them. A massive sign declares the location: Port of New Orleans. America. Hans breathes beside him, the word barely a whisper. They've brought us to America. The realization ripples through the prisoners like an electric current. America. The distant land they'd been told was weak, corrupted by Jews and Negroes, incapable of mounting a real war effort. Yet here they stand on its soil, looking at a harbor filled with warships and cargo vessels, at cranes unloading supplies in quantities that stagger the imagination, at a city stretching into the distance that shows no signs of rationing or hardship or war. Klaus feels something shift in his mind, a small crack forming in the edifice of everything he'd been taught. They disembark in groups of 100, marching down gangplanks onto American soil under the watchful eyes of military police. The dock workers, both white and Negro, pause in their labor to watch the Germans pass. Some of the Americans shout insults. Others just stare with curiosity. A few children wave from behind a fence until their mothers pull them back. The prisoners are loaded onto a train, not cattle cars, but actual passenger cars with seats and windows. Klaus takes a window seat and watches as New Orleans slides past. Streetcars clanging through intersections, shops with full window displays, people walking freely without fear of air raids. The train pulls out of the city, and suddenly they're moving through countryside so green and lush it seems like a fantasy. For hours, the train rolls westward. The prisoners press against windows, watching America unfold before their disbelieving eyes. They see farms with modern tractors, cattle herds numbering in the hundreds, oil derricks dotting the landscape like strange mechanical forests. They pass through small towns where every house seems to have an automobile parked outside, where children play in yards without a care for bombers overhead. "This can't be real," mutters a panzer sergeant named Otto, his face pressed against the glass. "This is propaganda. They're showing us fake towns to break our morale." But the display is too vast, too detailed to be fabrication. Mile after mile, hour after hour, the evidence of American abundance continues. Klaus watches farmland give way to flat grasslands, then to something he's never seen before. Vast, empty spaces stretching to the horizon. The land here is big in a way that Europe never was. Room enough for countries to get lost in. As the sun begins to set on their first day in America, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the train slows. Through the windows, Klaus sees their destination emerging from the flat Texas landscape. Camp Swift, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers posted at regular intervals. The train stops. Guards open the doors and begin calling out orders in German. The prisoners file out onto a wooden platform, forming ranks as they've been trained to do since basic training. American officers with clipboards move through the ranks, taking names and numbers, assigning barracks. Klaus stands at attention as an American captain walks past, inspecting the new arrivals. The officer is young, maybe 30. His uniform crisp despite the heat. He stops in front of Klaus's rank and speaks in careful, accented German. "Welcome to Texas, gentlemen. You'll find your accommodations inside. Dinner will be served at 1800 hours. The rules are simple. Obey orders, don't try to escape, and you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Any questions? No one speaks. The captain nods and moves on. As the sun disappears below the horizon and the first stars appear in the enormous Texas sky, Klaus Richter marches toward his barracks, toward whatever comes next, his mind reeling with questions he never expected to ask. He'd been prepared for cruelty, for hardship, for the brutal treatment that Nazi propaganda had promised awaited captured German soldiers. Instead, he'd found water when he was thirsty, food when he was hungry, and a land so impossibly prosperous it seemed like a dream. And the most unsettling thought of all begins to form in the back of his mind. What else had they been lied to about? June 15th, 1943. Camp Swift, Texas. Morning reveille echoes across the compound at 600 hours. Klaus wakes to the sound of a bugle call, momentarily disoriented by the wooden ceiling above his head instead of canvas tent fabric or open sky. The barracks are simple but sturdy. Wooden frame construction with screens on the windows, rows of steel cots with actual mattresses, foot lockers for personal belongings. It's Spartan, military, but cleaner and more comfortable than many of the Wehrmacht facilities he'd known in North Africa. The men around him stir, groaning as they swing their feet to the floor. Hans sits on the edge of his bunk, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I dreamed I was home," he says quietly. "Then I woke up and remembered." They dressed quickly in the clothing they'd been issued the night before. Clean uniforms with PW stenciled on the back in large white letters. Prisoner of war. The designation feels strange, official, as if their captivity has been bureaucratized into something orderly and legal rather than the chaos of warfare. Outside, the early morning air is already warm, carrying the scent of grass and dust. American MPs stand at intervals around the compound, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They look alert, but not hostile. More like factory supervisors than concentration camp guards. Klaus lines up with the others for roll call, the familiar military routine providing an odd sort of comfort. After roll call, they're marched to a large mess hall, a real building with tables and benches, not field kitchens or mess tins eaten while sitting in the dirt. Klaus enters with his metal tray and watches in disbelief as American cooks begin serving breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee, a small glass of orange juice. "This is a mistake," Otto mutters ahead of him in line. "They meant to serve this to their own soldiers." But the American cook just scoops another helping of eggs onto Otto's tray and waves him forward. No mistake. This is prisoner food. Klaus sits at a long wooden table and stares at his tray. In the last months in Africa, Wehrmacht rations had dwindled to nearly nothing. Hard bread, thin soup, whatever could be salvaged or captured. He'd become accustomed to constant hunger, to the gnawing emptiness in his belly that never quite went away. And now, as a prisoner, he has more food than he'd had as a soldier of the supposedly mighty Reich. Around him, men eat in stunned silence, broken only by the scrape of forks on metal trays. Some eat slowly, savoring every bite. Others devour their meals with the desperate speed of men who have known starvation. Klaus forces himself to eat deliberately, to not appear too grateful for what should be basic sustenance. The food sits heavily in his stomach, rich and almost too much after weeks of deprivation. But it's real. It's substantial. And there's enough of it. Over the following days, the routine of Camp Swift reveals itself. Roll call at dawn, breakfast, work assignments. Some prisoners are detailed to maintain the campgrounds, others to kitchen duty, laundry, or light construction projects. Lunch at noon, more work, dinner at 6, free time in the evenings, lights out at 10. It's regimented, controlled, but nothing like the nightmare scenarios they'd been warned about. The guards maintain discipline but rarely need to enforce it with violence. The work is not backbreaking. The food continues to be plentiful. 3 full meals a day, every day. With variety Klaus hadn't seen even in peacetime Germany. On his 3rd day, Klaus is assigned to a work detail outside the main compound. Under guard, a group of 30 prisoners is trucked to a nearby farm where they'll help with harvesting. The farmer, a weathered Texan named Mr. Henderson, watches them with suspicious eyes as they disembark. "Y'all know anything about cotton?" he asks through an interpreter. Some of the prisoners nod. Agriculture is agriculture, and many of them had grown up on farms in Bavaria, Saxony, Prussia. Henderson sets them to work in his fields, American guards watching from the shade of a large oak tree, while the Germans labor under the hot Texas sun. It's hard work, but familiar work. Klaus finds a strange satisfaction in the simple act of harvesting, his hands moving through motions that transcend nationality or politics. During a water break, Henderson approaches with a crate of cold soda bottles. "Coca-Cola," the interpreter explains as Henderson passes them out. "Drink." Klaus takes the bottle. Condensation beating on the glass, the liquid inside dark and mysterious. He's heard of Coca-Cola, the decadent American beverage that Nazi propaganda had mocked as symbolic of capitalist excess. He takes a sip, and the sweet, fizzy liquid explodes across his tongue, strange and wonderful, and unlike anything he's tasted before. "Good?" Henderson asks, his weathered face creasing into something that might be a smile. "Ja," Klaus admits. "Good." Henderson nods and returns to his porch, leaving the Germans to their break and their Coca-Colas. That evening, back at camp, Klaus writes his first letter home. The Americans have provided paper, pencils, and postage. All letters will be censored, the guards explain. But prisoners are encouraged to write to their families. Klaus stares at the blank page for a long time, wondering what he can possibly say. "Dear Mother and Father, I am alive and well. I have been taken prisoner by the Americans and am being held in a camp in a place called Texas. Please do not worry. We are being treated fairly." He pauses. How can he explain what fairly means? How can he describe the abundance, the orderliness, the sheer prosperity of this country without sounding like he's been broken by enemy propaganda? He decides on careful understatement. "We receive adequate food and medical care. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention. I am in good health and hope this letter finds you the same. Your son Klaus." What he doesn't write. "We eat better as prisoners than we did as soldiers. The Americans have so much they can afford to feed their enemies. Everything we were told was a lie." As weeks turn into months, Camp Swift develops its own peculiar culture. The prisoners organize themselves into a mini-society behind the wire. Those with skills teach classes, languages, mathematics, music. a makeshift theater troupe forms, performing plays and sketches for entertainment. The Americans provide musical instruments, art supplies, sports equipment. On Saturday evenings, the camp shows movies. Klaus attends his first one in late July, filing into a large recreation hall with several hundred other prisoners. An American sergeant operates a projector in the back, while a white sheet hangs on the front wall as a screen. The lights dim and images flicker to life. A Hollywood musical called Holiday Inn, starring Bing Crosby and Fred Astaire. For 2 hours, Klaus watches American propaganda at its most insidious. Not the crude caricatures and bombastic declarations of Goebbels' newsreels, but something far more dangerous. A vision of ordinary American life filled with romance, music, abundance, and happiness. The characters on screen worry about love and careers, about dance numbers and songs, about problems so trivial they would seem like paradise to the bombed-out citizens of Berlin or Hamburg. When the lights come up, Klaus sees his confusion reflected in the faces around him. Some prisoners applaud, caught up in the entertainment. Others sit in troubled silence, processing what they've seen. It's propaganda, Otto insists later, back in the barracks. All of it. The food, the movies, the treatment. They're trying to break us, to make us forget who we are. Or maybe, Hans says quietly from his bunk, they're just showing us who they are. The debate continues late into the night. What is real? What is manipulation? What any of it means. But Klaus notices that even Otto doesn't refuse the food, doesn't boycott the movies, doesn't reject the small comforts that Camp Swift offers. By August, the camp population has swelled to nearly 4,000 prisoners. New arrivals come regularly, fresh from North Africa or from U-boats sunk in the Atlantic. Each group brings the same initial shock, the same disbelief at their treatment. And each group gradually settles into the strange reality of American captivity. Klaus gets assigned to work in the camp library, a collection of books in German and English that the Red Cross has provided. He spends his days organizing shelves, checking out books to prisoners, and reading voraciously. He discovers American authors, Steinbeck, Hemingway, London. He reads about American history, about their Revolution and Civil War, about their strange democratic system that somehow built the prosperous nation he's now imprisoned in. One September afternoon, a new prisoner arrives. Lieutenant Friedrich Becker, a young officer from Berlin who'd been captured in Sicily. He's escorted to the library by an American lieutenant who seems to know him personally. Friedrich here speaks excellent English, the American says to Klaus. I thought he might help with cataloging. You two work it out. After the American leaves, Klaus eyes the new arrival warily. Officers and enlisted men don't always mix well, even in captivity. But Becker just smiles wearily and extends his hand. Forget the rank, he says. We're all just prisoners here. They work in companionable silence for a while before Becker speaks again. You know what's the strangest thing about this place? It's not the food or the movies or even the treatment. It's that they genuinely don't seem to hate us. The guards, the officers, even the civilians we see. They treat us like a problem to be managed, not enemies to be destroyed. Klaus nods slowly. He's felt it too. That peculiar American pragmatism that views even war as something that can be bureaucratized, systematized, made rational. My father is a party member. Becker continues, his voice dropping. A true believer. He wrote me letters about the Jewish conspiracy, about the racial struggle, about the existential battle between Germany and the degenerate West. And now I'm here, in the heart of that supposedly degenerate West, being treated better than I was in my own army. He laughs, but there's no humor in it. What do you do when everything you were raised to believe turns out to be backwards? Klaus doesn't have an answer. He's been asking himself the same question for months. That night, lying on his bunk and listening to the sounds of men sleeping around him, Klaus thinks about the peculiar paradise they found themselves in. Paradise behind barbed wire, comfort in captivity, abundance in imprisonment. The contradictions pile up, impossible to reconcile with what they'd been taught, with what they'd believed. Outside, a guard walks his rounds, boots crunching on gravel. Somewhere in the distance, a radio plays American swing music. The Texas stars shine overhead, the same stars that shine on Germany. But somehow the sky here seems bigger, more open, full of possibilities Klaus is only beginning to imagine. He thinks about his parents receiving his carefully worded letter, reading between the lines, wondering what has happened to their son. He thinks about the war still raging in Europe, about his former comrades fighting and dying for a cause that seems increasingly hollow from this vantage point. He thinks about the movies and the Coca-Cola and the scrambled eggs and what it all means. And he realizes that Camp Swift, this prison in the middle of Texas, has become the most dangerous battlefield he's ever been on. Not dangerous to his body, but to everything he thought he knew about the world. November 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The first cold front of autumn sweeps across the plains. Klaus stands in the recreation yard, watching a group of prisoners play football. Not the American version, but proper fussball with a worn leather ball the Red Cross provided. The temperature has dropped to the 50s, which the Texan guards consider frigid, but which feels refreshingly familiar to the Germans. He's been a prisoner for 5 months now, and the strangeness of it has settled into routine, the impossible made mundane through repetition. But today is different. Today, a special visitor has arrived at Camp Swift. The prisoners are assembled in the mess hall at 1400 hours, the largest gathering space in the compound. American officers stand along the walls while a projector is wheeled to the front of the room. Major Reynolds, the camp commander, steps forward, a tall, gray-haired man from Pennsylvania who speaks serviceable German. "Gentlemen," Reynolds begins, his voice carrying across the crowded hall. "What I'm about to show you is difficult to watch. Some of you will not believe it. Some of you will be angry. But under the terms of the Geneva Convention and in the interest of truth, we believe you have a right to see this." A murmur ripples through the assembled prisoners. Klaus exchanges glances with Hans, who sits beside him, both men uncertain what to expect. The lights dim. The projector whirs to life. What follows is 40 minutes of footage that will haunt Klaus for the rest of his life. Images flicker across the screen, grainy, black and white, undeniably real. American soldiers liberating a camp, but not a prisoner of war camp like Swift. Something else entirely, something worse than Klaus's darkest nightmares. Piles of corpses, emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Living skeletons with hollow eyes staring at the camera. Children, impossibly thin, their ribs visible through papery skin. Cremation ovens, gas chambers disguised as showers. Mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, human hair. The footage is from various camps. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, others whose names Klaus doesn't recognize. American and British soldiers move through scenes of systematic horror, their faces showing shock and revulsion. German civilians from nearby towns are forced to walk through the camps to witness what was done in their name. Some vomit, some weep. Some simply stare in numb disbelief. Around Klaus, the reactions vary wildly. Some prisoners sit in stunned silence. Others shout that it's fake, propaganda, impossible. A few weep openly. Klaus himself feels his stomach churning, his mind refusing to process what his eyes are seeing. Lügen propaganda. Someone screams from the back. Lies. Propaganda. But the footage continues, relentless and undeniable. Testimony from survivors. Documents showing the bureaucratic machinery of extermination. Maps of the vast network of camps spreading across occupied Europe. Numbers: 6 million Jews, millions more of Poles, Russians, Roma, homosexuals, political prisoners, the disabled. When the lights finally come up, the room is chaos. Men shouting, arguing, some still insisting it's all fabricated. American guards stand ready, hands on their weapons. But Reynolds raises his hands for silence. "I know this is difficult," he says, his German careful and clear. "I know many of you served honorably, believed you were fighting for your country. But this," he gestures at the blank screen, "this is what was happening while you fought. This is what the regime you served was doing." "We didn't know," Otto shouts, his face red with anger or shame or both. "We were soldiers, not politicians. We fought for Germany, not for that." "Perhaps you didn't know?" Reynolds responds, his voice not unkind. "But your ignorance doesn't change what happened. Your country, your government, your Führer. This is what they built while telling you about glory and honor and the greatness of the Reich." The meeting dissolves into heated arguments that continue long after the prisoners are dismissed. Back in the barracks, men cluster in groups, debating furiously. Some remain convinced it's all Allied lies. Others struggle to reconcile what they've seen with what they believed. Still others retreat into silence, processing privately what cannot be spoken aloud. Klaus sits on his bunk, his hands shaking. He thinks about the propaganda films he saw during training, the ones showing Jews as parasites and subhumans, as enemies of the German people. He'd accepted those images unquestioningly, the way he'd accepted everything else the Reich told him. But now, those images collide with what he's just witnessed, not propaganda caricatures, but human beings, starved and tortured and murdered on an industrial scale. Friedrich Becker appears at his bunk, his face ashen. "My father," he says quietly, "worked in the administrative offices in Berlin, transportation logistics. He used to complain about the resource allocation to the eastern camps, said they were diverting too many trains from the military supply lines." He sits down heavily on the edge of Klaus's bunk. He knew. He had to have known what those trains were carrying, where they were going. And he never said anything. He just complained about efficiency. Over the following weeks, the camp divides into factions. Some prisoners, mostly older officers and true believers, maintain that the footage was staged, that the Allies are conducting a sophisticated propaganda operation to demoralize the German people. They hold secret meetings in the barracks, whisper about maintaining loyalty to the Reich, about how they'll be called to account if they waver in their faith. Others, like Klaus and Friedrich, find themselves in a more painful position, forced to confront the possibility that everything they fought for was built on a foundation of monstrous evil. They gather in the library, reading everything they can find about the camps, about the Nazi regime, about the ideology they'd served without fully understanding it. Hans takes a different path. He throws himself into the American education programs the camp offers, learning English with fierce determination, reading American history and philosophy. "I don't want to be German anymore," he tells Klaus one evening. "Not the Germany we came from. Maybe I can become something else." The work details continue. Klaus still goes out to Henderson's farm, still harvests crops under the Texas sun. But something has changed. When Henderson offers them Coca-Colas now, Klaus sees it differently. Not as a small kindness from a captor, but as evidence of a fundamental difference in worldview. The Americans can afford to be generous to their prisoners because their society isn't built on hatred and fear. They can show movies and serve decent food and treat enemies humanely because they don't see war as a cosmic racial struggle, but as a political conflict that will eventually end. One December afternoon, Klaus is working in the library when an American chaplain arrives, Captain Walsh, a Catholic priest from Boston who volunteers at the camp. He's come to organize a Christmas celebration, he explains through the interpreter, and wants to know if the prisoners would like to participate. "Christmas?" Klaus asks. "You'll let us celebrate Christmas?" Walsh looks puzzled. "Of course. You're Christians, aren't you?" "Well, most of you. The Geneva Convention guarantees freedom of religious practice for prisoners of war." Klaus almost laughs at the absurdity. The regime he served had been systematically murdering millions, yet here in the enemy's prison camp, they're offered the freedom to celebrate the birth of Christ. Christmas Eve, 1943 at Camp Swift is unlike anything Klaus could have imagined a year ago. The prisoners decorate a large pine tree the Americans have brought in, singing carols in German while American guards stand nearby, some humming along to melodies that transcend language. There's a special dinner: roast turkey, potatoes, vegetables, even apple pie. Captain Walsh conducts a midnight mass in the recreation hall, prisoners and a few American soldiers praying together in their different languages to the same God. Klaus receives a package from his parents. It took months to arrive, passing through Red Cross channels and military sensors. Inside, a letter, some photographs, a hand-knit scarf. His mother's letter is carefully worded, speaking of hardship and rationing and air raids, but maintaining hope for his safety and eventual return. She doesn't mention the camps. Perhaps she doesn't know. Perhaps she knows and cannot bear to write it. He reads the letter 3 times, trying to imagine the woman who wrote it, his mother, who raised him to be a good German, who celebrated when he joined the Wehrmacht, who believed in the Führer's promises of greatness. Would she understand what he's learned here? Could she? New Year's 1944 arrives with celebration in the camp. The Americans organize a dance, inviting local women from the nearby town to serve as partners. Heavily chaperoned, of course, but still an astonishing gesture. Klaus watches from the sidelines as some of his fellow prisoners waltz with American girls, the absurdity of it all almost too much to process. They're at war with these people, yet here they are, dancing. Friedrich approaches with 2 cups of punch. "I've decided something," he says, handing Klaus a cup. "When this war ends, and it will end, we both know Germany is losing. I'm not going back. I'll find a way to stay here or go to Canada or anywhere but Germany. I can't go back to that country, not after what we've learned." Your family, Klaus begins. My family believed in a lie. Friedrich interrupts, his voice harsh. My father helped murder people and called it logistics. My mother looked the other way and called it patriotism. I won't be part of that anymore. Klaus sips his punch, considering. He thinks about his own family, his small village in Bavaria, the life that waits for him when the war ends. Can he go back to that? Can he pretend not to know what he knows now? The months continue to pass. Spring arrives in Texas with wildflowers covering the plains in carpets of color. Klaus's English improves enough to have simple conversations with the guards, some of whom are surprisingly young, 18, 19, not much different from the German prisoners they watch. He learns their names: Joe from Illinois, Tommy from Georgia, Mike from New York. They're not monsters or supermen, just ordinary men doing a job, counting the days until they can go home. News from Europe filters in through carefully censored newspapers and radio broadcasts. The Allies land in Normandy in June 1944. The Red Army advances from the east. German cities fall to round-the-clock bombing. The war that once seemed it might last forever is clearly entering its final phase, and Germany is losing. In the camp library, Klaus reads an American magazine article about the reconstruction plans for post-war Europe. The Marshall Plan, they're calling it. American aid to rebuild the shattered continent, including Germany. Even in defeat, even after everything the Nazis have done, the Americans plan to help their enemies recover. Why? He asks Captain Walsh during one of the chaplain's visits. Why would you help us after what we've done? Walsh considers the question carefully. Because we believe people can change, he says finally. We believe that Germans, once freed from Nazi ideology, can build a better society. We believe in redemption, in second chances. That's what America is supposed to be about, the idea that your past doesn't have to determine your future. It's a radical notion to Klaus, raised in a society built on blood and soil, on the idea that birth and race determine everything, the American belief that people can choose who they become, that societies can be remade, that even enemies can be redeemed. It's both naive and strangely hopeful. As summer turns to autumn in 1944, Klaus has been a prisoner for over a year. He's gained weight, healthy on American food. He's learned enough English to read simple books. He's worked on farms and in kitchens, played football and watched movies, celebrated Christmas and argued philosophy with fellow prisoners who've become friends rather than just comrades. And through it all, the careful construction of his worldview has crumbled, brick by brick, until he stands on uncertain ground, forced to build something new from the ruins of what he once believed. One October evening, he writes another letter home. Dear Mother and Father, I am well. The weather here is turning cooler, though nothing like our Bavarian winters. I think of home often, but I must confess that I am no longer certain what home means anymore. I have learned things here, seen things that have changed me in ways I cannot fully explain in a censored letter. When the war ends and I return, if I return, I will not be the same son who left. I hope you can understand, though I'm not certain I fully understand it myself. Know that I love you and that I am trying to become a better man than the soldier who left Germany 2 years ago. Your son Klaus. He seals the letter and hands it to the mail clerk, knowing it will be read by American censors, knowing his parents will struggle to decode his meaning. But some truths cannot be spoken directly. They must be learned through experience, through the slow, painful process of having certainty replaced by doubt, propaganda by reality, hatred by reluctant understanding. As the sun sets over Camp Swift, painting the Texas sky in brilliant colors, Klaus stands in the recreation yard and watches his fellow prisoners moving through their evening routines. They're no longer the confident soldiers of the Africa Corps who surrendered 16 months ago. They're something else now. Men caught between identities, between the country they came from and the country that holds them captive, between the certainty of propaganda and the complexity of truth. The barbed wire still surrounds them. The guard towers still stand watch. They're still prisoners, still technically enemies of America. But in the strangest twist of all, this Texas prison camp has given them something their own country never did: the freedom to question, to doubt, to change their minds about who they are and what they believe. Paradise behind barbed wire. The thought no longer seems contradictory to Klaus. Perhaps paradise isn't a place without constraints, but a place where even prisoners can discover truth, where even enemies can be treated with humanity, where even the defeated can imagine a different future. The bugle sounds for evening mess. Klaus joins the line of men filing toward the mess hall, toward another meal of improbable abundance, toward another evening in the paradox of American captivity. Tomorrow he'll wake to another day of imprisonment and uncertainty. But for the first time since his surrender on that dusty North African battlefield, Klaus Richter feels something he never expected to feel as a prisoner of war. Hope